Thank you all for coming, and thank you for all of our panelists being here with us as well. I'm Katie Eccles. I'm an attorney by trade. I came out of Stanford Law School and Stanford undergraduate before that, so I have a deep connection with this organization. But most importantly, I'm a proud Utahn. Despite a short stint in Boise, my very early years, you can take that up with my parents. But my family on both sides have called the West our home for 5 generations, and we have very strong ties to our rural communities. My mother was born and raised in Fairview in central Utah, a small sheep ranching community, and my father enjoyed his summers in LaBarge, Wyoming at Journey's End, his grandparents' ranch. We still own and visit both places regularly, and we carry on our ancestors' love and respect for the land and for the life that it sustains, for the beauty of the landscape, and most importantly, for the small town values and the way of life of these rural places. I have to admit, in full disclosure, on the other hand, we also own the Golden Hershey Inn up the road there at Mid-Mountain in Deer Valley, right smack in the heart of this area, with a well-established amenity migration where visitors and second homeowners are very well accepted. So we kind of have personally experienced the range of emotions and address the issues and concerns that come on both sides of the issue of amenity migration. So this has made this panel and this conference particularly interesting to me. So I'm privileged to be here today to be a part of it. Thank you. As you all are very well aware, every year people from across this country and from around the world venture into all of the rural parts of our American West for our iconic mountains, our valleys, our beautiful deserts and cliffs. And for most visitors, the West rural communities are really just a gateway to their recreation and their tourism. For some, they decide to stay and retire or have a second home. But in whichever case, for all these rural towns, amenity tourism and migration has come to shape and define the economy, as we heard about already in the prior panel. But the economic benefits, as we also talked about earlier today, also come with their own unique set of challenges. For example, amenity migration particularly affects our middle and low income residents who are faced with rising rents and increased costs of living, and the question of whether they or their children can afford to stay on the lands that they've stewarded for generations. For them, amenity tourism is very much a cultural issue, as their rural communities grapple with maintaining their identity while also hosting a growing influx of outsiders. And what is an outsider? To my grandfather, and this is 100 years ago, but in Fairview, he used to say if you weren't second generation, then you were still an immigrant. So you can kind of imagine what he would maybe think of this conversation about amenity migration. In many ways, Utah is really an ideal context to have this conversation. It's a state long known for our abundance of outdoor recreation opportunities. And so gives us the opportunity to examine the issue both from a historical and a contemporary context. Some destinations, like right here in Park City, have established a thriving amenity tourism industry over several generations. But other destination communities, like Moab down in eastern Utah, are more recently dealing with these demands of expanding tourism. Moab, as we saw earlier on the maps that were posted on their PowerPoints, is situated between several national parks, world-renowned recreation areas, and it really is struggling to balance that needs of that growing tourist industry along with the concerns of their local residents. Recently, their local news, the Moab Sun News, published a series of op-eds about the issue, and one resident summed it up pretty concisely, and he said, quote, "A healthy, stable tourism industry is an asset to our community. An out-of-control, rapidly expanding tourism industry is a threat to our quality of life." So, with this as a bit of a backdrop, the broader context for this panel is this. Across the West, the arrival of amenity migrants to rural destinations has created several cultural divides. How does a community balance long-standing local values with those of amenity newcomers? Or do they even want to? How does a community accommodate the growth it knows is coming without losing its small town character that attracted its year-round residents? Of course, there are the practical, economic, political, environmental issues, and we're going to cover those in the other panels. But today, at this panel, we want to examine that more elusive topic of the cultural clash created by amenity migration in different parts of the rural West. There are many, like the residents of Moab, who feel that something may be lost as small rural communities shift towards satisfying the desires of amenity migrants. This question of cultural impact, I think, really pervades the entire question and any discussion that we have about amenity tourism. It's a question that refocuses our attention on the very real and the very personal effect that this has on everyday local life in the rural American West. And it reminds us that the preservation and respect for rural residents and their lifestyles is as important as our preservation and respect for the land and the landscapes themselves. Now, in keeping with the interdisciplinary approach of the Rural West Conference, this panel has invited 3 panelists to address these cultural issues from 3 different perspectives. Today, we have with us Amy Joy O'Donoghue, an award-winning journalist for the Deseret News, and who reports regularly on energy, environment, and the rural life. And she's a resident of Hooper, Utah. Justin Farrell is an author and professor at Yale University and a native of Cheyenne, Wyoming. In 2014, he launched the Yale North American West Initiative. And Carl Fisher is the executive director of Save Our Canyons, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting the Wasatch Mountains and canyons, and he grew up in the Wasatch foothills right here. And our format today is we're going to start with a little 10-minute or so presentation from each of our panelists. And then I'll have pose a few questions and start a conversation between them, and then we'd love to turn the time over to the audience. We think that's where the best questions and inquiries come from. So with that in mind, I'll turn it over to our speakers. We'll start with Amy Joy, and then we'll have Justin and Carl. Thank you.
I'm in denial, but if I put these on once in a while, don't make fun of me. Thank you for having me here today. I'm very honored and privileged to be amongst some people who are concerned about what's going on in the rural West and how these communities are grappling with all these challenges. Years and years ago, I had the privilege of moving into a little rental home in a community called Huntsville up in picturesque Ogden Valley. And I had the mountains behind me and a lakefront to look at. And it was just a beautiful time in my life. But all of a sudden, they started putting a home in on the mountain above me, looking right down into my backyard. And I thought, what? So I was in town and I ran into the mayor and I said, what's going on? Why did you approve that development? Don't you know I was just enjoying my life? And he said, where do you live again? And I told him, and he said, that home's only been in there about 20 years. I bet there's a lot of people that said the same thing when you moved in. So I guess we can't shut the door. And as much as we'd like to sometimes, but I don't think that's why we're here today. We're here to talk about amenity migrants and how that's shaping small towns in Utah and across the West. I think sometimes what happens is you have folks on the East Coast who venture out this way and they have a vision in their mind that we're all just sagebrush. Maybe we still ride a horse to get somewhere. It's dry and dusty and ugly, and then they land in a place like Utah, and they're like, whoa. And they explore Zion, and they explore Arches, and they decide, you know, this is a good place to be. And they don't realize that Utah is like the 9th most urbanized state in the country. And we have all these people packed along here. You get out into the further reaches of these rural places, though, and you have these like 7 counties that between 2016 and 2017 were actually experiencing population drops. So you have to ask yourself why. And I'm sure many of you talked about it earlier today about the decreases in the farming community, the decreases in ranching, the decreases in the mining jobs and coal mines that are shutting down, and that has something to do with it. But but frankly, there's just not a lot of high-tech jobs available in some of these communities. They also face this additional challenge of having a lot of federal land ownership. Now, that could be a blessing for some of us, but a curse for others, depending on how you look at it. As I've covered these topics, it ends up on both sides. Garfield, for example, they have 96% of their land controlled by the federal government. Oops, I missed that one. Grand County is 87%, and they have an unemployment rate that usually hovers around 5.3%. Yet at the same time in January, when the tourists go away, their unemployment rate is 14%. In August, when everybody's in town, it's 3%. So they have to struggle with this volatility in their economy. Kane County, which is beautiful, 89.7%. San Juan, 92%. Unemployment at 72%. So they've got these beautiful landscapes, but some real rural challenges in terms of how to manage their economies. And I'm not telling any of you anything you don't know. I'm not the expert. But I have found out over the years that these federal lands are fodder for fierce fights. Can I find another F? Ferociously fierce fights with arms flailing. Let me paint a picture for you. In July of 2016, Sally Jewell, then Interior Secretary, decided to come to our corner of the world in southeast Utah. She was there to look at a landscape called Bears Eaters. And close your eyes if you want. She shows up into town. Conservation groups, the Native American tribes that are pushing for this monument designation, they're all smiles and they're so happy. The county commissioners, they have a pretty grim look on their face. One tells me her mind is made up. This is a done deal. We're going to get the monument whether we want it or not. And you have Sally Jewell. She's up in the mountains. She's in the meadows. She's with the tribes. She's with the conservation groups. They're having a powwow. They're holding hands. They're posing. She's posing for photos. She's doing selfies with the cute Native American kids. Voila. A few months later, we got us a monument. Flash forward a couple years. Trump is in office and he orders a monument review. And we have a seismic shift in perspectives. Secretary Zinke had not even touched foot in Utah when the Native American tribes and the environmental groups and the conservation organizations were screaming for his head. The county commissioners were smiling. They posed for pictures with him. They got into a Black Hawk helicopter and went for a ride. They went up on horseback to Bears Ears Meadow. I think they took a couple selfies too. This is our landscape of federal land management. Wow, I went past all my notes. I think, after talking to a lot of folks in different corners of our little world, that amenity migration comes down to the haves and the have-nots. The have and have-nots. It's a fight between those who have a certain way of life and those who don't have that certain way of life and they don't understand it and they want to change it. And that may not be the case all the time, but it is the case a lot of the time. I talked to a Garfield rancher, and I think Pat Shea probably knows who I am talking about here. We are not going to name names. He might have held an office or two. He said, I would no more dream of going to San Francisco and telling those people how to run their lives than fly to the moon, if he could. But yeah, you have these people coming into my town, my county, and they're telling me what to do. They say ranching is bad. What's up with that? And then I talked to a San Juan Navajo lady who was running the desk at a hotel in Blanding. And I said, what do you think about this Bears Ear stuff? And I said, I'm not going to quote you. And she said, I just wish it would go away. The place I used to think was so sacred, people are driving to it now. They say they want to protect it, but I think they're going to hurt it. I've also heard, oh good, I'm almost done, yes. I've also heard about the fact that these cultures can't coexist. And I wonder about that. I think there's a way to find common ground if everybody's willing to give up a little bit to meet in the middle, but between lawsuits and protests and angry signs and people getting in people's faces, it's really hard to find common ground. There was a time in Moab a few years back when an oil and gas company was putting in a natural gas pipeline to capture the natural gas that was flaring off one of its most productive wells. Now, on the one hand, you're capturing some pollution, so that's a good thing. But on the other hand, groups were opposed to the pipeline because it was scarring the landscape. And they also didn't like the fact that the oil and gas infrastructure was located so close to Dead Horse State Park and Canyonlands National Park. So I went tooling out there and drove around and looked at it and was painted all these different colors to blend, but you could definitely see the activity. So I went out to the visitor center, the island in the sky, and I started talking to tourists. I'm like, what do you think of that stuff coming up the road? What stuff? The oil and gas activity. They're like, well, it's okay. I guess it has to be somewhere, or maybe they should get rid of it. But for most people didn't really notice it. So I had to wonder, maybe they can coexist. Maybe put up markers and people can still bike. Fast forward real quick. The phrase we hear so often is keep public lands in public hands. And the question I'd like to pose for you today is, who's the public? Is it the rancher? Is it the river runner? Is it the rock climber? I'm trying to think of another R word. Is it the dim hotel desk clerk? Is it just the mom who wants to go for the walk? The biker? Is it the oil rig guy? The truth is, public is all of us, and we need to find a way to share. I have a favorite song, a lot of them actually, my husband will drive you nuts. And it's by Don Henley, it's called The Last Resort. And a line from that song says, who will provide the grand design? What is yours and what is mine? Because there is no more new frontier, and we have got to make it here. And then he ends it by saying, they call it paradise. I don't know why you call it paradise. You can kiss it goodbye. Let's hope not. Thank you.
So my name is Justin Farrell. I'm a professor at Yale University in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And I mentioned I'm from Cheyenne, Wyoming. Sorry, I know there are a lot of Utahns here. I hope you can make room for someone from Wyoming. There's not a lot of us, but so a lot of my work that I'm going to talk about today takes place in Wyoming, and I teach a field course where I bring my students out to Wyoming. So a lot of that work is kind of centered there, but a lot of the issues are very similar. It's just kind of transport one town for another in some ways. But I wanted today to talk about understanding cultural clash and to really kind of break down what we're talking about here and provide some of the findings from two of the books that I've written on this topic about amenity migration and kind of what happens when new people move into town, and then that the environmental conflict piece, and then the second part will be my new book on ultra-wealthy moving into some of these communities was one population that I argue that we don't know a lot about. I'm hoping to help improve that situation, but these are the kind of two things I'll be talking about today. And I do think we need to think harder about what we mean by cultural clash, and maybe that'll help us find some solutions to some of the problems that we're facing. So culture might be overstated, it's ignored and misunderstood, but I think in part. And I think much of the work that we do as observers, as myself as a scholar doing research, we have a poor understanding of human culture, and not just a poor understanding, but I think that we don't give it enough credence and we don't give it enough attention when we're trying to figure out what to do about some of these issues. I think one reason is because culture itself, and I put that in quotes, it's a fuzzy concept. It involves deeper ways that humans make sense of their lives, they find meaning in their life, and it can feel a little nebulous, and it's definitely difficult to measure empirically. And so that's kind of one reason why I don't think we have a good understanding of it. But when we derive meaning from the communities in which we live and the people that we surround ourselves with, and the traditions that we're a part of, and in other words, these social and cultural ingredients that make up what we might call a way of life, or ways of life for different groups of people. But when it comes to understanding cultural clash, the topic here we're discussing in this panel, I think we tend to focus more on how groups come to be in conflict than why, right? And the underlying reasons why there is so much conflict. And in the book that I'll talk about in a second, I argue that a lot of us decision makers in different levels in the government and NGOs and so forth, that we miss out on some of the underlying causes of conflict because we don't first understand the different cultures at play a lot of the times. And then we don't understand also how important they are in practice. In an attempt to solve some of these problems, we often just marshal more scientific facts, more technical expertise, thinking that it'll help adjudicate between sometimes cultural differences that are essentially incommensurable and sometimes, and deeply held worldviews that, again, we don't pay enough attention to. And I think this is especially true in the Mid West, where different groups and as we've talked about, ways of life are really coming into contact like they hadn't before. And so it's not just social class, but also racial, ethnic, religious contact, and so on. Let's see here. That's huge. That's the cover of my 2015 book that was on this very topic about cultural conflict, and I focused on the environment. And the subtitle of my book really says it all: Morality and the Sacred Roots of Environmental Conflict. And put in its broadest terms, my argument is that this modern obsession with scientific, legal, economic reasoning, which I think is all great, but I do think it misses out on some of the deeper cultural mechanisms that drive these clashes in the first place. And so indeed, I think we need much more natural science, much more legal and economic research, but there's a foundational piece of the puzzle that I tried to show in this book that we're missing with a lot of these issues. So I try to, in my book and in my research, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, we should reorient ourselves, at least in some regard, to these why questions that make life meaningful for people and for different social groups. And I know that sounds vague, kind of strange even, but I think that will help us understand kind of what's going on in some cases. And it's not just, how do people determine whether something's right or wrong, kind of an abstract, isolated sense, but it's what people view as a good life, a life well lived, sort of the purpose of their life, and these sorts of things. And I make a living essentially about asking people about that and then writing about it, or trying to. So, for example, when an industry declines, that's much more than just an economic loss, right? That's a cultural loss. And in some cases, it can be viewed as their way of life being devalued by another group in a very deep way that would be almost crossing a sacred boundary, essentially. So this idea of devaluation, in my book I call it moral devaluation, that your way of life is not only outdated and maybe not up to speed with technology, but it's actually wrong, and we shouldn't do that anymore. So that means a lot, obviously, to certain people who feel that way. And a lot of, we heard that in the last talk as well, and some great examples of that. So as a social scientist, I'm really, again, interested in kind of uncovering these cultural values that people subscribe to, these moral values, religious values that drive a lot of how they think and act, that may not make it into the public discourse or the political discourse. If you're giving a speech at a city council meeting or something, you may not refer to these values because that's not the setting in which you do that, but nevertheless, they're still operating. So I try to really show how they work in practice in very concrete ways. And not just in the ways that they can bring on conflict, right? But the ways that they can also bring solutions, and they can provide common ground, they can provide understanding, hopefully collaboration, and maybe in these days civility, if we understand kind of where another person or another group of people are coming from. So let's see here. Data and method, I shouldn't even have put this slide in here. I wanted to have, to kind of give you a sense of, I'm talking abstractly so far, but how do we actually do this? How do you study culture from a scientific point of view and using scientific methods? A lot of my work is qualitative, essentially talking with people, doing interviews with folks, doing participant observation where you may go spend a day with a rancher, you may spend a couple days with a federal bureaucrat, and so I do a lot of work out in the field, doing interviews with scientists, interviews with religious leaders, people who are members of these communities that are coming in and kind of descending on these areas to understand kind of what is going on. But I also do a lot of quantitative work, and that's on this right side here, and trying to understand how communities are structured, essentially. And these graphs here, the one on the bottom right, are all the nonprofit groups in Teton County, Wyoming, which is where Jackson, Wyoming. And to understand where are the size of these red dots are the resources that these organizations have, to understand who are the players in the community, how are they all connected, so the different lines between them are these different connections they share via board members or via even informal connections that I've recorded. And so combining this, what we call network science, with this qualitative, in-depth, on-the-ground research has been really fruitful. And then I've also used text analysis on, for example, in this book here, automatically coding public comment letters. So if through the NEPA process, say a couple 100,000 public comment letters are sent in, that's too many to read for us, unless you have just a team of researchers. But you can train a computer to pick out themes in those texts and to save a lot of time for reading those and looking for themes and people making arguments like, this land means a lot, this land is, I'm a 5th generation rancher, and you can pick out these sorts of meanings that come to play and come to bear on this conflicts. So I had a couple pictures from my book that are in color here and black and white in the book, but just from some of the different conflicts that I cover, and those on the bottom right left are all the letters that were written about the wolf issue. You can tell most of them are not obviously from near Yellowstone. They came from all over the US, and it was really interesting to see what people were writing. And they're more idealistic in their writing about the wolf if they're further away from where the wolf is. That probably doesn't surprise a lot of people here, but and then I have like interviews with a guy who has a picture of a wolf in his office in a high-rise in Chicago. He likes to look at it. He's never been to Yellowstone, never seen a wolf, but it provides meaning for him and connection to nature. But he also has had an impact on the policy there, which locals are obviously weren't too happy about, and still kind of aren't. So that's trying to unpack this idea that culture matters and how it matters. My latest project is a new book that I just finished. Let's see here. And it's called Billionaire Wilderness. And it is basically a follow-up to this first book in some ways, because I saw the amount of money moving into Teton County, I better hurry, which is the wealthiest county per capita in the United States. And it hasn't always been that way. It's very similar to Park City if you haven't been to Jackson. And I wanted to essentially do a scientific study of the wealthy folks who are moving into these types of communities and to talk to them about, again, these same sorts of issues. Why do you find the West meaningful? Why do you find nature meaningful to you? How do you get involved in the community, whether that's through philanthropy, through environmental projects, and how does the West, in a sense, transform this class of people? And that's the topic of the book. I don't have time to go into all the results, but I interviewed 155 ultra-wealthy people, did 4 years of in-person observation with them, and then interviewed 50 low-income, mostly Mexican immigrants who work for the ultra-wealthy. And so I have about 205 interviews, too much data to dig through, but ultimately I was interested in their relationship to the West, essentially, and their impact on a community like Jackson, and then also how they are received by those folks who had lived there before them. I don't have time to go into the puzzles, but essentially I was looking for, I asked them questions such as, why did your life turn out the way it did? Do you feel criticized when you move into a Western community like this? Why do you love Wrangler jeans and frontier art so much, essentially? I didn't ask it that way, but that became a big part of the book, actually. Not the Wranglers, but what was kind of underneath that. So I ended up writing a lot more about the romanticization of rural life and what that means to them. And in some ways, that's almost as appealing as being able to go skiing. It's tapping into something most viewed as like primordial America, going back to a way things were, and is very appealing to a lot of these folks who had worked stressful jobs on Wall Street, worked 80 hours a week, and things like that. And so trying to find and locate the meaning that they have that the West gives them as well. I don't go into these dilemmas, but you could read the book. Essentially, they make use of rural culture to transform themselves into normal people, and nature does that. I know it's funny, but this is a very difficult book to write because there's so many people are critical of people with wealth these days, and I didn't want it to come off like that. I really tried to do an honest account of what they think and tell it from their perspective. I think some of the things may make you cringe. Some of the people are very nice and really cared about the community. But ultimately, it came down to kind of finding meaning in the West. And I can talk more about that in person, too. All right. Thanks.
Hello. While he's pulling that up, I will just quickly introduce myself here. My name's Carl Fisher. I'm the executive director of an organization based here in Salt Lake City called Save Our Canyons. Our long name is the Citizens Committee to Save Our Canyons because we recognized we need people to try and protect some of these places. The organization was started in 1972. Thankfully, before I was born, because I feel like I was able to reap some of the benefits of their labors as an organization. But really, we started, as I thought about it, in response to amenity migration. Snowbird Ski Resort, there wasn't a term for it, I don't think, back in 1972. So we didn't know what we were doing, but we knew it was important, and there was no a word for it. But Snowbird Ski Resort opened in Little Cottonwood Canyon, just over the ridge line here, in 1972, and one of our founders literally wrote the book on skiing in the Wasatch Mountains and history of skiing in Utah. So it wasn't because we were anti-skiing. We were legitimately concerned about, could this canyon hold what was coming to it, all of the people that were coming to this place. And then fast forward now, almost 50 years as an organization, we're kind of seeing full circle that we might not have been able to. And maybe there were some things that we could have put in place to help deal with that. So that's really about, but we work at all levels. We work with the city all the way up, we worked in the halls of Congress. So we've worked with anybody and everybody to try and protect the resource. So just to give a quick overview of the Wasatch Range, and this isn't all of it, but it runs 160 miles from the Idaho border down to about the Nephi area is the geographic extent. And our organization has really tried, with one brief moment where we worked on a development plan for the Ochre Mountains when mining went down and real estate went up, Kennecott Land was looking at developing out there. And so we tried to bring some of the lessons we've observed over the years to help that community not replicate the mistakes of the past as the east bench of the Salt Lake Valley grew. So, but an interesting statistic is that 85% of Utah's population lives within 15 miles of the Wasatch Mountains. So when there was someone mentioned the density, the urbanization, that's where it's at. And why do people live within 15 miles? Because the Wasatch Mountains catch the water. And that's what gives these valleys life, the lives that we enjoy here. So zooming in, I want to focus on the central Wasatch Mountains and kind of give you an overview of of some of the things that we're working on here. So the central Wasatch Mountains. You drove up the northern extent of it today, most likely, as you came up Parley's Canyon. We define that as part of the central Wasatch, and it really goes over to the Little Cottonwood Ridgeline and over here into Park City. We have to stop at county lines for some reason in Utah for the tops of mountains to define mountains, not by their terminus at their bases. But that's another, I guess, political discussion. So that red box is kind of a zoom in of this area, but you can see the Salt Lake Valley there. So in the central Wasatch area, I think it's important to note about 1 million people get their drinking water from this place. There are over 650 miles of trails. It's home to 6 ski areas. There are 3 wilderness areas. World-class dispersed recreational opportunities from backcountry skiing to rock climbing to mountain biking to trail running. I personally love all of these things, but I'm very concerned about the impacts we are collectively having on this place. But it's also an important landscape for wildlife migrations, wildlife that move across the Wasatch Ranges. We've built everything in the valleys. The mountains, the alpine areas are the places that wildlife move through the region. And we need to be cognizant of the other creatures that we share this place with. Oh yeah, you're about right there on this map. Actually, you might not be right there because I think that was the old address the other address that I went to. I got a little lost on my way here. So, but within like a couple miles. So, kind of an interesting thing, just Salt Lake County, again, just over the other side of the ridge here. Here's some just figures about the area. So yeah, we were pretty small back in 1970 when my organization was started, and we've jumped to 1.1 million people in that valley. That's some massive growth that we've been experiencing. The visits to the forest and I'll full disclosure here on the forest, we now have a super forest that happened back in 2007 or 8, where we merged with one of the adjoining forests. So it was the Wasatch Cache National Forest. Now we're the Uinta Wasatch Cache National Forest. Taking a model from kind of corporate, mergers and things like that. The forest did the same thing. But now we're experiencing over 10 million visits to this area, right? And that's an insane amount of pressure for a place like this. And it's a national forest, right? This is not a national park. These are national forest system lands, and I think they're not the upper echelon, if you will, of public lands in the state of Utah. Just a hair above BLM. Sorry, Pat. So, and I think you saw this, and it presented a little differently in another slide. But we do have about 6 million annual visits just in the central Wasatch. We did a recreation study where we surveyed recreationists out at trailheads for a full calendar year because we have 4 seasons of very intensive use here. Partnered with Utah State University to do that helped determine that number. But then you can see the visitation these other places get that are national parks. I was reminded by a dear friend, Rick Reese, who lived in the Salt Lake Valley, that the Wasatch Mountains enjoy the same topographic relief as the Grand Teton. From the top of the Grand Teton to Jackson Hole is the exact same from the top of the Twin Peaks wilderness area to the Salt Lake Valley. So imagine the Grand Teton National Park with the amount of development right around Jenny Lake, because that's about what we've done here in the Salt Lake Valley. And back to Forest Service just being up right above BLM. At a panel discussion I was on a few weeks ago with the Forest Service, they reminded us that they get about 30 cents per visitor to manage this landscape. And he also said that at one site in the Wasatch, one campground or something like that, not even a campground, a day use area, they went through 250 plus rolls of toilet paper in one single day. okay? And that's where your 30 cents is going. So, we've known for years, we've known for decades that this was coming. But I fervently believe that some of our elected leaders over the past didn't want to grapple with the issues that we were dealing with here along the Wasatch Front and kicked the can down the road. And the threats continue to build and magnify and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And we have a real challenge on our hands. So another thing we did as part of this study was to try and understand why people come to the Central Wasatch. What is it that draws people here? And so these are just some of the things they said. I'm going to flash this through quick. But scenic beauty, enjoy nature, adventure, right? Peace and tranquility with like several million of your best friends. Improve your physical health, and being with friends and enjoying activities. It is interesting that we found, and the Utah State reminded us of this when they were doing this study, people actually in the Wasatch go up there for solitude, but we found that interactions with other people positively enhances their experience, which just, it's kind of backwards, right? But that's something that I like to remind myself of up there. So then we asked about some of the amenities in the Wasatch, and the ones that I've circled are ones where the satisfaction is lower than the importance, okay? So environmental conditions. People have a lower satisfaction, but they feel that that's very important. The availability of parking, we'll get there. Trail conditions and trail signage. And these were some of the repetitive terms. We had some open-ended questions. So things that kept coming up of the people that we surveyed. So preservation, watershed, people recognizing that they do get their water from these places that we're playing. Wilderness, a strong love of our protected wilderness areas. Protect, keep it wild, and development. And when they looked at the comments about development, because they got so many comments about development, they noticed that people were using the word development two ways. So they plotted it on a continuum for us, and basically said, on one end of the development continuum, we'll just call it wilderness, right? That's that picture on my right, your left. Wilderness. And then the other side of that continuum, we have basically the Salt Lake Valley, intensive urbanization and density. When people were using the words development, oh boy, these were the words that they were using in opposition: housing, hotels, ski area expansion, additional ski lifts, additional ski connections. Things that they supported when they were using development in the positive: trails, parking lots, and public transportation. So we plotted the people on the development continuum right there. And Utah State said the people that we were surveying in that community, very biocentric in their kind of values towards the Wasatch Mountains. People do have a very good ethic of stewardship for this place, which is encouraging. So I'm probably not going to have time to get into this one, but I just want to say that there are a bunch of policies in the forest plan that manage this area that have acknowledged some of these problems. They have been embodied in plans since about 1985 or so, and we still haven't found a solution to a lot of these problems. Saying that we should not expand our parking lots beyond the levels that they were at in the year 2000. Because I guess Amy Joy and I are both quoting famous songs, but basically the Forest Service plan says it's the Joni Mitchell policy, I call it. We don't want to pave paradise and put up a parking lot in the Wasatch. So we are on a collision course. in the Wasatch. The number one use, there's no one use, I would say, that is having an impact on the Wasatch. I think it is our collective use and just the intensity of the use that we're experiencing in this place. We have things, we have spats between different recreational endeavors, if you will, whether it's a skier at a ski resort or a skier in the backcountry, right? Where we're making more people, we're not making more land. Whether it is hiking versus biking, people want separated trails, right? The 650 trails, if people don't want to share those trails, we can be looking easily at 1,300 miles of trails, right? So again, yeah, making more uses than we are land. Traffic, quickly, LA is known for its traffic. And for its commuter traffic, and Los Angeles, as a famous backcountry skier has coined it, is known for its recreational traffic, especially in the wintertime. The thing that's driving these traffic jams is really it's competition for powder. It's competition for a first chair. There are, probably 30,000 plus people in these canyons on the busiest of days, and they're all trying to get to 2 or 3 points at the same time. I don't know that there's a way to plan around that. Megan's going to help, though. Another thing we're experiencing is just because of this intensive use, the rapid loss of native fauna. So this is just a list of species that we have extirpated from the Wasatch because of our uses, because of our behaviors. And in place, there's the additions of non-native species that are coming to this place. They're changing the ecology, and they're changing the chemistry of our landscapes, right? And this is because of use. So I think to wrap this up quickly, I think that there are a couple things going on, a few things we can do. But I do think that there's an imbalance in our policies of protection versus development. I hear it all the time, mainly because it's pointed at me at the legislature, at a county council, or something like that, the radical environmentalist, right? That we don't want anything to change, or I don't know what's radical, but I think on the contrary, what's radical is development. Protection isn't nearly as permanent as development. And I think we need to be much more methodical. You can administratively, through an administrative process, develop a parcel of land, build a ski resort, open an oil and gas mine. On the flip side, to protect a landscape, it practically takes an act of Congress, and good luck with that. So I think that there is an imbalance there. And so things that we need, I think that we need to, as we're looking and grappling with recreation, migration, and amenity migration issues, we have to remember what our values are and what our values of this place are, and some of the intrinsic values of place, and try and put plans in place to help us get to that place, to protect those values, because oftentimes those values are irreplaceable. I think we need to shift our behaviors from consumptive to more symbiotic with the landscape. And I think we need more funding. Oftentimes you see amenities pop up, and the money will go to build a soccer stadium in Sandy instead of stewarding the resource that generated a lot of the revenue that they took some of the dollars that were generated by that amenity. We need to do a better job of earmarking some of those funds to steward some of the impacts of recreation. And I guess that's it. I guess I would leave it with saying, again, I think, Amy, where I actually wrapped my conversation was, who do public lands belong to? Do they belong to the adjacent landowner? Do they belong to the adjacent ski resort? Do they belong to the recreationist? Do they belong to the county or the city in which they reside? Or do they belong to future generations? Thanks.
Thank you. Very informational from, again, different perspectives, and inform us all. We y'all talked and addressed various sides of the question of conflict. We talked about visitors. We talked about those who are trying to find themselves and find something that's fulfilling for themselves, and those who want to come in and live, but then they also want to change what they found. Do you find that those different visitors, those different newcomers, evoke a different reaction in the residents who live there? In other words, do old-timers, so to speak, respond differently to seasonal recreational enthusiasts versus retirees who come and settle and stay versus those who are second homeowners who come and go throughout the year? There are different reactions from the residents of these rural communities.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I do. I was trying to think of an example. And I think it just depends. So in this new project, I did find, I did some research in the Yellowstone Club. Has anybody heard of the Yellowstone Club? It's an ultra-exclusive club in Big Sky. Many billionaire members. That is viewed differently than if you bought a second home, near Bozeman or even in Big Sky, because they've sort of locked up a huge swath of land. And I do know that there's some pushback there because there was lands that people used to hunt and fish on that they can, it's basically an armed guard at the gate, and you just can't go up there anymore. So I do know that there's animosity, especially when the newcomers take that land and then lock it up, which makes sense. What did you want?
I guess through my just talking to people, and we table at a lot of markets, and I try to be at a lot of community events and talk to people. And I'm often approached by people that moved here from out of state, migrants, if you will. And what they come to us and say is, we're so glad that there's an organization like yours working to protect these values, because we left the place because our values were compromised. And so I think that there are people, especially when you're talking about public lands, I think people have different interactions with those lands, and I'm not afraid of them, but I do feel sometimes like our local communities, we're like the boiled frog. The change is happening around us, but it's happening gradually, and we're not quite understanding it. And people that have lived it can share some of those experiences, and we should really heed some of their warnings, but not let them take over our places.
Hi, thank you. A lot of the town leaders I've talked to over the years, they love sharing their landscapes with visitors, and they're proud of the Red Rock country in Moab, and they're come on in and take you to the local diner, drop a dime, drop 10 dimes, drop a couple $100, spend the night, and then just keep going down the road. And I think that's what caught Moab by surprise, like so many of the people have mentioned here, is that when the uranium bust happened in that community and it dried up, they were struggling, and they turned to recreation as a Band-Aid. It was never meant to take over their community, and so now they're left struggling with trying to find affordable housing for school teachers and for police officers. And for the older folks in the community, I think there's some level of resentment because they see their offspring being priced out of homes because of the people that have come in and bought. The ultra wealthy have come in and driven up the price of housing there. And so what was once something to be proud of has turned into a nightmare they don't know how to manage. And Carl and I have talked about this before. It's like, are the Wasatch Canyons destined to become the new Moab? Or are they already? In terms of how much can we use these canyons before we start to degrade the experience? And the park system hasn't figured it out. And I don't think the Forest Service has figured it out for our canyons either.
I'll add too that one of the things that I found that was most interesting and perhaps most troubling. So say, a place like Teton County, many ultra wealthy people move in there. There's all sorts of impacts, as we've talked about, for that. Locals might be fine with some of the economic development that would occur, but a lot of the costs aren't being made up by the ultra wealthy people themselves. So even though that they have a lot of power, economic power, political power, they're very well educated, most of them. So when you look at the data, a lot of the things that they get involved in when they come into town, they want to get involved in philanthropy. That's sort of social circles, especially in Jackson. They get involved in environmental groups who, in my view, don't need the money. They already have way too much money. That whole area is already conserved. I mean, there are issues there, like anywhere. There's pressures. But the disproportionate amount of money that is given to environmental groups versus groups that are trying to help those rural communities adapt. And most of the wealthy folks who move in just don't see that as an interesting issue. It's sort of like a buzzkill, because they're coming there because they're sort of trying to escape the ills of society. And when you get there and you see that there's homelessness in Jackson, homeless kids, sharing motel rooms, that the cost of living is skyrocketing, that those aren't issues that they really are. They may be interested in those back home, maybe in wherever they come from, Connecticut, New York, California, Texas, but they're just not something that they want to put their energy or dollars into. They just get involved in conservation, and they think that's sort of the currency and the social status and the thing to do, which to me, and I sort of push this in the book, but I try to just write about what's going on, but it is a shame, I think, because there's so much potential.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Just quickly, I mean, experiences are totally in the human realm, right? They're very, I guess, anthropocentric. They center around people. And I think we need to temper if you're going to Zion National Park on Memorial Day weekend, temper your expectations. If you're going into the Wasatch on a day that it just puked 3 feet of snow, temper your expectations. What I think we need to do a better job of is trying to extrapolate the intrinsic values of the landscape that are irreplaceable and adjust our behaviors accordingly in order to sustain that thing that is irreplaceable.
Thank you. As you have been doing your studies and your travels and your interviewing, have you seen any specific on-the-ground kind of changes that have been increased by amenity migration? For example, are there touch points in a community, a seed store, a local market, a gathering place that has been lost or is maybe lost because of this demographic shift? Can you share any specific stories in that way?
I can just speak anecdotally to that. I mean, I haven't, I've talked to people who believe that San Juan County, because of the Bears Ears, I mean, it's home to some really stunning landscapes, and it's the path less traveled. But Blanding is a dry town. Not a lot of people know that, and so the grocery store is closed on Sunday, and they don't have a stoplight, and so there's a lot of people in that town who feel if those three things go away, then they've given up the fight, and they're going to become the next Moab, and they don't want that to happen.
I guess I would just say almost any place that's within a quarter mile of a road in the Wasatch, maybe a half mile. But I think it's just changed where people are going, because there are hot spots that people flock to, and it's that there have been other places that are really special that have almost been abandoned. Like I know where to find great powder skiing or solitude on a powder day, and not have to wait in traffic. I think I I don't think I got stuck in one traffic jam this year because I tempered my expectations. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you where they are. But yeah, you can go other places that used to be really busy backcountry trailheads, but they've kind of been forgotten about, and you can still get to those. But we've concentrated our uses in a lot of regards, I'd say.
That's an interesting question. And one thing that I found that was really interesting was that folks who may arrive in these communities and say the seed store does close, or if you're in Wyoming, an old bar closes, there's an effort to build a new one on almost like a faux version of those, and because they really like that, right? But it may be a Whole Foods that looks like a farmer's market, but it costs a lot more, right? Or maybe like a bar, the cowboy bar. That's kind of authentic, somewhat authentic. I like that place in Jackson. But I will say that that's what's interesting to me, that there's a desire to also preserve this shadow version of real rural authenticity. But and to preserve it, but it's really not either, because it's mostly exclusive and not really tied to actual ways of life that rural folks have lived.
I mean, does that go to the point you were making earlier about many wealthy people who move in to find their soul, but by moving in, they often change it, either intentionally or unintentionally. It changes the character of it, so then they want to make sure that they really don't want to give up their Starbucks, but they'd like it to be in a cute coffee shop.
Exactly, and it's a place where they could go and dress down still, but it's still a nice, good coffee, a $5 latte, but it may not feel like it does in Greenwich, Connecticut, or something. But yeah, I do see that all the time, where it's almost like a new Thai place. So there's just all these really nice restaurants are opening and replacing old ones that were there, but maybe they weren't as quote unquote as good of food or something. Yeah.
And probably our last question, then we'll turn the time over to you in the audience. But again, we've talked. It's been interesting to hear the conflict and then the different scenarios with different migrants and people moving in. You know, both groups, the ones who are the current residents and those who move in, want to find meaning, but then they want to change it at the same time. Do you have suggestions, thoughts on how we can successfully balance these competing interests? You know, and how both rural residents and amenity migrants can manage their expectations and address the situation, approach the situation from each side to find a palatable solution that works for both.
I think the example earlier about the bouldering and how there were two different groups coming together then, when the locals were, being taught how to boulder, and then the people who boulder were being dragged behind horses. This is like a really cool idea. I mean, so as long as there's no broken bones involved. But and I also think, to Carl's words earlier about stewardship, I think if locals really care about a landscape, and if they, the Forest Service and the BLM, they're so understaffed. If they got involved in a little bit of volunteer work and did some education of tourists about this is, you don't pick up these shards, you don't pick up the pots, and you stay on the trail, and this is what we do to be better stewards of our environment. But I think just sitting down and having some conversations is the best place to start. But I think if you can meld the two, the coffee shop was a good idea too.
Yeah, I mean, again, for me, it always comes back to values, identification of your values, and collectively trying to figure out, full well recognizing that not all values are going to be in alignment, and try and reconcile some of those issues. But put a plan in place to try and protect those things that are irreplaceable and a core uniting theme of our communities. It seems that thing for the Wasatch, in my experience, has been watershed. People have this anti-degradation standard for their drinking water, and I think that's a really cool thing that people acknowledge that. But I do think oftentimes our policies, our land use codes, our laws at the federal level don't support that. And I think we need to get to a place where it might be harder to develop a piece of land than it is to protect a piece of land. And we are definitely not there in my perspective.
I will say that I think in terms of the wealthy migrants, I definitely don't think they're acting in bad faith or intentionally. I think that some of them just romanticize rural life and romanticize even rural poverty in some ways as people who are like truly happy and like living on the land and these sorts of things, but don't understand deficiencies in education, deficiencies in healthcare, all of these things. And if I guess the answer isn't always education, but in this case, essentially cracking that veneer of I'm moving to the West and it's going to be paradise, and that there aren't problems, and that rural life isn't as idyllic as we might think.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Yes, please. Oh, and let's wait for the mic, I know, so everyone can hear. Thank you.
The way I look at it, this amenity migration really involves, at one level or another, displacement, whether it's political or physical. And all of the communities we've been talking about, this isn't the first displacement. And one of the things that I didn't hear in any of the presentations was any reference to Native peoples. I heard a little bit, and Amy Joy talked about this a little bit, but all of these communities really started with an initial displacement. Native history is erased. Native peoples are physically removed and legally removed. And I think that we have to keep our eye on that. And maybe I'd ask you to talk a little bit about that, maybe for Amy Joy, because when you spoke, you did mention San Juan Navajos, which is essentially, that's a bitter rhetoric that is used commonly in southeastern Utah to set Navajos on one side of a state line apart from others. And the way in which Bears Ears was reduced also, I think, played on that kind of rhetoric. And we're talking really about cultural conflict, but really Euro-American cultural conflict between extractive, resource-based economies, perhaps, and modern amenity-based tourist economies. And I just think that's something we should also keep in mind when we talk about culture clash in the rural West, because Native people and reservations are rural West.
Thank you.
I'm not sure what your question is, but definitely I do believe that the Native American people down in that part of southern Utah in some ways are capitalizing on the tourist trade and tourist industry. There's a couple of tribal members who have outfitting expedition companies. They take people out, and they're well versed in the landscape, and they're taking advantage of the increased visitation in that area. But there is a divide between the Navajo who live in southern Utah and the Navajo who live in other, well, that's what I hear from some of the Navajo people I talk to down there, because all the money goes to Window Rock and very little of it comes back up to San Juan. And that's what I hear from the locals down there who complain about the fact that they're living in places that do not have electricity, and a lot of the oil revenue that comes off that Aneth Field was going down to Window Rock. So there's a disconnect between some tribal members and other tribal members, and they fight with each other. There's long family history there of where they don't speak to each other anymore. So no, I don't think you can characterize any group of people with one generalization at all. But some of the people I talked to down there were definitely afraid of what increased visitation to the landscape would do to a place that was pretty well tucked away.
I appreciate that comment, and I agree. That was, while I didn't include it in my presentation in the Wasatch, I definitely reflect, especially in preparation for these types of things, about how the ethic of kind of stewardship that the Native American people have for these places. And I think that's why I try and talk a lot about our reverence for these places beyond just crushing POW or endless miles of single track. It's what is the real connection? Is crushing POW just that means to that end, or is it about something deeper in trying to connect with a place? Like for me, when I first started backcountry ski touring in the Wasatch, it's the only time I've seen a northern goshawk, and it swooped at me. And that moment, I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck, and I felt this amazing connection to the land that I think is often lost in our adventurous pursuits about what these landscapes really mean and have meant. But thanks for that comment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'm more familiar with the tribes in Wyoming on the Wind River Reservation, and they're facing some of the similar challenges, albeit they're more difficult. But in terms of, or maybe a recreation economy, oil gas development, those sorts of things. Last year, took my class and we met with some of the tribal elders for both tribes, and it was just a really eye-opening experience, I think, for my students, for myself, in terms of the barriers they're facing that obviously many other rural communities are facing too. I will say I do, in my new book, I open up the first story of the introduction is walking into this house, this magnificent house at the base of the Tetons for this environmental organization that was having a fundraiser. And right when you walk into this house, there's this about 4-foot bronze statue of a Native American woman. I'm not sure which tribe, but it really sort of hit home for me in the sense of the way that the Native Americans are also kind of lumped into this romanticization of nature as well, and sort of kind of viewed as one and the same, and almost not even viewed as people. And so that kind of hit home for me, and that was a theme throughout my book in the sense of the ways that rural people are romanticized. I think tribes are as well. It's good to keep in mind.
Yes, Felicity?
Yeah, I appreciate that comment and question too very much. But going from the sort of millennial history of the area and the ethic of preservation there to get into the 21st century and where we're going, you talked about values, Justin. I'm curious how the internet, in particular geotagging and things like that, are affecting the values of people who come to who are part of amenity migration, and if the internet is changing the values.
I haven't done any formal research on that. Actually, I was just talking to my PhD student Paul, who's over there. You should say hi to him later. And we kind of just briefly mentioned just the Instagram effect, right? And especially with places like Moab and all of that. I imagine it's had an effect, but I don't know of any data out there, any studies. There might be, but.
Does it change the values?
I think it can instill values. I mean, I guess it would depend on changing values from what to what. But yeah, I imagine that deeply affects people's values in some ways.
I'll probably get skewered for saying this, but I get skewered for a lot of things. No, I think that it does. I think the internet, and I think social media, and I think things. It's very narcissistic. It's all about me. And when I'm going to a national park or I'm going into a wild landscape, for me, it's always been about the place. And I think for other people, it's about me. That selfie is about me. It's not the camera's pointing towards you, not outward, right? To try and take in. So, I mean, I think it tends to denude these places of their intrinsic value and override them with kind of a narcissistic value of me.
Yeah, I agree with him completely. You can discover some place on the internet, go there, and you have no history, no background, no grounding at all in its value as a landscape. And I think that's why you're seeing incidences of graffiti increasing so much in our national parks and other landscapes. And it may be other cultures who are coming here. I don't know. I'm making a guess, but maybe Europeans who are coming over here, or Asians, or who knows, that come here who don't understand that maybe this is a special place, that it is sacred to Native American tribes. They don't get it. And so I think, again, this is a place where we need to beef up our resources and do some cultural education with visitors who come to this area. I mean, there's only one ranger, I believe, who works with the BLM in all of what was formerly the Bears Ears National Monument at 1.35 million acres. And it's an incredibly vast landscape where you can get lost, hurt, or where you can do irreparable damage. And we just need more ways to educate people, and especially people who come out to the West who may have this ideal that, like he said, is not necessarily grounded in reality.
Yes. Oh, Tia's coming.
Okay, so I'm getting increasingly dazed and confused here because the first panel was about the economic challenges and the fact that the extractive counties are doing worse and the tourism counties are doing better. And then the second one, I get the sense that in some idealized world, there would be this optimal balance between recreation, preservation, and the sort of economic demands of getting more revenue into the state. But I don't see how the hell you get there, because basically the state of Utah went forward with, what was it called, Big Five or something? It was really promoting itself as a tourist destination, but it wasn't done in coordination with the state and federal agencies that run these parks. And so when you talk to the National Park Service people, which we did when we came through here in sophomore college, they were besieged with people that they couldn't handle. And this is at a time when the National Park Service and the Forest Service are being cut by the Trump administration for reasons of keeping the size of government down. So I don't see how you get to this balanced vision without A, knowing exactly what that right balance is, B, having somebody with authority to sort of work and coordinate all that, which goes against the ethos of a lot of interior Western states in terms of letting the private sector decide it all. And then thirdly, how you coordinate across state, federal, and local lands to get to this vision. So I'm dazed and confused. So maybe you guys can tell me how you get there.
No, I think I've actually done my job as an extremist. So you're welcome. No, I mean, I think again, I think there has to be coordination amongst and respect amongst various jurisdictions. I really take issue with the terminology federal control. It's federally managed. It is managed for the benefit not of you, but for the public. And I guess we can define what the public is. But that's what we need. Public lands and the protection of these places and the management of these places, it needs to happen cooperatively. It needs to, it takes a long time, oftentimes more time than people are willing to wait, to generations. I think, it was said in 1989 in a local plan for the Central Wasatch that we need to establish this place as a national recreation area and we need to fix transportation problems. And people stuck their heads in the snow for 30 plus years. That's unacceptable to me. I feel like I've been on this insane downhill slide, just watching these things happen. I worked in tourism. I worked at ski resorts. I was volunteering for Save Our Canyons while working at a ski area. I don't agree with the ski areas, but we can have conversations, and we do have some shared values. I should say I don't always agree with them, if I didn't qualify that. But what does concern me is that revenues generated off of these landscapes oftentimes doesn't go back into protecting and stewarding our values. They get turned into things like trying to make these landscapes more accommodating, heated chairlifts, you know? It's just, the fact that we're trying to make it more comfortable to go into to 10,000 feet in the mountain and to make it safer to drive in winter at 10,000 feet it just boggles my mind. We're at capacity in these places, and we're still trying to make it easier and easier and easier for people to drop $20 there, right? If people drop that $20 and it actually goes into not taking from, but giving back to what we value and giving back to this place, I think it's a net benefit. But it takes, I think, a lot of political backbone and will to not give those benefits to your buddy. And I feel like that's what happens over and over in the state.
I have to say, I take issue with the word federal control. Is that what you said? Okay, well, they're federally owned. They're not always federally managed because sometimes these agencies are overwhelmed. So that's where we will disagree. But I think you hit that. I think you summed up everybody's frustration, is that we've been talking about this for years and years and years, and yet nothing is changing or nothing is happening. And I think the brilliant planner in the red jacket from Midway, forgive me, I forgot your name, Megan, I think she nailed it earlier when she said that Midway decided to come up with a plan and start thinking about the future before everything changed it too rapidly for them. So they went out and they passed an open space bond. Wasatch County, and I wrote about this, they passed the bond. And so they're acting now to preserve some open space and define their community or redefine their community before things explode around them. And God bless the people who decided to protect the ridgelines and make them state parks. You know, that's awesome. So I think it's all about a community being willing to look at itself in the mirror and ask the hard question of how are we going to be looked at 20 years from now, and is that the way we want to go, or not? And I think the local community needs to start first asking itself, what's wrong with this picture? Moab resisted for years and years and years. They wanted the acre lots, the quarter acre lots. They didn't want density housing, multi-density housing, because that's going to degrade the character of their town. Well, now they have homeless people just like Jackson does. And so the community needs to be willing to make the hard decisions and then work with their state and local partners and tap into resources like the Rural Online Initiative and be willing to change where they can.
But I mean, so let's take a ski resort, for example. The money that they make, and they pay permits to the Forest Service, to the federal government, where does that money go? It goes to the Treasury and basically goes to building bombs for overseas or something like that, right? It doesn't do anything to benefit the lands that are being used locally. No money is coming to the. We're in our 40th. Pat will probably correct me, but maybe 30th year of basically starve the beast politics, and it's manifesting itself in a pretty nasty way. And our local communities need to step up to the plate with resources to offset and help administer and manage and partner with these agencies in achieving our shared goals. And our shared visions and our shared values for these places. And I don't know how somebody controls something with 30 cents per person. I can't give somebody 30 cents in this room and now I control you, right? That's what these agencies have to help. That's not control. That's being railroaded by millions of people. So I think these places are managed, federally managed. I don't think that federal agencies have the resources to do the job that they need to do, and I think we locally, in good faith, not for some, do this or else I'm pulling my money away, but in good faith, come with money to the table to try and administer and manage and protect these places.
Amen.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Right here, and then we'll go back there. Is that all right?
I just want to go back to the values question, I think, Felicity, that you brought up, and I also just want to give you a shout out for the article that was shared with us, because I think it touches on a key value question that I'd like to hear from each of you. I also just want to say on the question of Instagram or social media, which I think we should rebrand social media as proclamation platforms. I think that would be a much better way. The question that this whole presentation has in mind, or brought to mind for me, and what Felicity's article touched upon, is I know that probably each one of you has the value of conservation or environmental ethic, and what we've known about any sort of thing that you want to have people care about is that they have to have repeated exposure to it. That's number one, and they have to have mentors that sort of show them how to care for that thing. And I'm struck by that continuum that you put up, and I wanted to ask, is that continuum, was that study done at Trailheads? Was that was where people were asked? I kind of wonder what the results would be if that study had been done in downtown San Francisco or in downtown Chicago or some really urban place. And I wanted to ask each of you to maybe say, how do you deal with that tension of, yeah, I want people to have the environmental ethic, and I know that they have to be exposed to it, but I also know that we can't overcrowd these things. So how do you balance that? Because I sort of see that as one of the key tensions for this whole conversation, is that we do want people to go there, or we want people to experience, they need to experience it, but they may be experiencing too much of it. And I should say that I live in San Francisco. I had an environmental ethic, but now I stop going sometimes because it's just so damn crowded at the places near San Francisco.
Awesome question, and I struggle with that a lot. I guess my issue is I do think people need to interact with the landscape in order to appreciate it. It's something that does need to be experienced oftentimes. Maybe you can read about it in his book a little bit, and you'll get something from that. But I really do think you have to experience these places. I guess my issue, as we continue to essentially overpopulate the planet, I think busyness is just something we have to temper our expectations to. What bothers me the most is how we accommodate that busyness. I think that busyness should actually serve as a little bit of a, like, oh man, it's Memorial Day weekend, maybe I shouldn't go to Zion National Park with the millions of other people, right? I mean, I came out of a backpacking trip on the Zion Narrows, and walking the gateway to the Narrows, the paved portion that gets you to the river, we exited on Memorial Day after not seeing people for like 3 days. And it was like walking down a New York City sidewalk at 5 p.m. It was insane, right? And so I haven't done that again. And I think that needs to be part of the expectation. But what bothers me is, like, in Little Cottonwood Canyon, we're having traffic jams. So the solution is to build more roads or to build more parking lots up there, or try and figure out how to pump more people into these places. And I don't think that's necessarily the answer. It's recognizing that it's changing that behavior and saying, like, man, it just snowed 3 feet. Maybe I shouldn't go to Little Cottonwood Canyon. Maybe I should venture into some other place that's only a half an hour further, instead of sitting in traffic for 6 hours for a ski day that was once 30 minutes away, right? So I think that's the thing that bothers our organization the most about this, is that perpetual accommodation, because it's always N+1. It's always N+1. It's always, we can accommodate 1,000 more people. We can accommodate another, and now if we continue to accommodate, those canyons will be superhighways in the central Wasatch, and I don't think that's the answer. I hope that got to your question.
I think, too, it's important to be clear about who we're talking about. And so tourism is one thing, day visitors are another. I think second, third, fourth homeowners are another. Buying a $10 million home in Jackson and being there a couple weeks a year, I don't know if you're developing that ethic, right? And that's different. And I don't know how you stop that within the current political system within which we operate, especially in Wyoming. There's state income tax. There's a lot of incentives to move there. And so you could tweak some of those things, I suppose. But in terms of the environmental ethic among the population of ultra wealthy folks that I've interviewed and tried to understand, it's more about enjoying nature, but getting a break from the fast-paced, kind of hectic, and even morally hazardous way of life that they live outside of there. And so maybe there's an ethic being developed, but I wouldn't say it's the same as if you were going backpacking every few weeks or something and developing it that way.
For my part, I try to do what I can through my stories and educate people that way with, don't go on Memorial Day. Go during the shoulder seasons. You're going to have a much more enjoyable time. Plan your trip in advance. If you're going to show up to the park, go before 10 o'clock in the morning or, stay well past 6. But we have become a society of instant gratification. And I think over the last 30 years, in talking to people, it used to be the people that ran the rivers were the river rats, the ones that were into extreme thrills. And now it's mom and dad and Junior and Sally and everybody wants a bigger thrill, more extreme, exciting adventure. And so the demand for these type of experiences is just going to escalate as we populate more. And it's no longer going to be just walking out on some scary glassing over Grand Canyon. Now we're going to be bungee cording in it or who knows what. And there's a certain segment of society who's the throwaway society. You just run in, run out, and it doesn't matter. You see it everywhere you go, whether it's a concert hall or a restaurant or your city streets or after the snow melts. I mean, there's trash everywhere. And there's a certain segment that they don't care. And it's unfortunate. And I wish there was a way that the National Park Service, other agencies, newspapers, televisions, organizations like this could be more aggressive in public information campaigns to teach an ethic of stewardship and to leave no trace. And I personally, I don't go up to the Wasatch Canyons. I live in Weber County in a place where it's much less discovered, and I have friends who are outdoorsy types who are saying, when's it going to hit here? When's it going to hit here? I can't wait because my home value is going to go up. And I'm like, shh, don't. I can still hike in some of the places I like to hike, and I can avoid the crowds. But it's coming. It's coming.
Thank you guys so much. Do we have time for, I promised one question back in the back, or should we do it? Or Pat, go ahead.
Yeah,
Last question. We'll close with.
And Katie, this is no comment about you as a lawyer, but Brigham Young and Shakespeare shared an idea about lawyers and how to deal with them, getting rid of them. When I left BLM, I had 850 lawsuits where I was named as a defendant. And by some estimates, the land management agencies spend upwards of 30% of their time dealing with lawsuits. What's the solution there? Should we have a 5-year moratorium where if anybody decides to sue, they run the risk that if they lose, they have to pay?
Sure. I think I will say that our organization was very litigious in its inception, but I think I have not filed one lawsuit on behalf of our organization since I've been its director for now over 10 years now. I don't think lawsuits are always the answer. I do think that sometimes they are necessary. But sometimes they are frivolous. But I do think I actually recently went through the Forest Service objection process, which I think is a good process, and I think it will help reduce the number of lawsuits that federal agencies are receiving. On the other hand, these are public lands, and I do talk with a fair number of land managers who feel that comments that come to them through the NEPA process are disregarded as clamor. And I think if we're to take the temperature down on public lands issues, land managers need to do a better job of understanding people who might not be as sophisticated as you or I strive to be in expressing themselves on issues of importance. But disregarding something that somebody put some thought into and obviously passion, and disregarding it as clamor, I think is destructive and will result in more lawsuits.
So, in the last chapter of my book on environmental conflict, I told this story as the main subject of the story, and there was this effort in the Hoback Mountains to drill for natural gas. There was a Houston company owned the rights, the leases. But I told this story about how these longtime residents, more conservative, private property rights oriented, found common ground with these environmental groups over the issue of not being litigious, about buying out the leases. And then the other thing that they found common ground on was that they both felt the land was, their slogan, they started a group together, it was too special to drill. So that this ethic of intrinsic value of the land, and they were able to find common ground. And that may be hard to come by these days, but it was sort of an example, the one that I found, where people were working together based on shared values, and even shared values about how you go about accomplishing something politically.
I've read a lot of lawsuits, and I've seen lawsuits that are grounded in what I believe to be sound legal argument on either side of the political spectrum. So it does give organizations a voice, but I do believe they leave agencies in paralysis. If you look at the wild horse problem, it's just nobody can do anything to solve it. And I also believe that in today's jurisprudence that the spectrum of who has standing to bring a lawsuit has been probably unnecessarily broadened and is overgenerous, but that's just me. I mean, our Utah legislature did pass a law which I think is a good step in the right direction regarding nuisance lawsuits against agriculture, and it is not intended to shut down people who have a complaint about how animals are being treated, but it does provide parameters for when somebody can bring a lawsuit, and they have to live within a half a mile of the farm. They have to have brought the lawsuit within I think it's within 1 year of when that operation substantially changed its operations. So it protects farmers, but it also gives people legal recourse. I think lawsuits are ridiculous, but keeps me in business writing about them.
Thank you. I'd like to, can we give our panelists a round of applause? Thank you for sharing your thoughts and perspectives with us today. You get a break. Get a wonderful break. I know you're ready. So you can meet back downstairs at 5:30 for the reception and dinner, and enjoy yourselves until then.